Welcome to Marx Headroom. This is the third episode. And there's a little background because there's not many of you that have been watching. And so I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about myself. And where do I start? Well, I grew up in the Ozarks, which is in Missouri. For the most part, the Ozarks go down into Arkansas. It's country. And I have a mix of hillbilly influence, Indian influence, and then some sophisticated, educated influence from my early childhood. And how did I end up here? I'm in Austin, Texas, and I'm 61 years old, and I produce videos mostly with my own content. I do some film acting and some commercial work, and that's been, well, relatively, I mean, by most standards, totally a failure. But I've been doing that for about 10 years, as well as, to be honest, just taking care of a lot of good people around me through various means. And, here I am. So, Austin, Texas, September 5th, 2025. Marx Headroom. I've been really kind of nervous about this episode. Some of the feedback I've been getting on my other channels, I've got 3 that are active right now. One is called Future Wise Energy, and I speak from my experience in oil and gas, where I started 2 oil companies. I have a petroleum engineering degree, and that was I was a great athlete in high school. And that opened up the avenue of getting an education and entering an industry outside of the Ozarks, which my father was very, very encouraging for me to get out and find other opportunities, which I did. So I went out in the world and I left college football behind, but I ended up getting this petroleum engineering degree, which took me around the world and all over the US and put some pretty interesting characters and stories in front of me over the years. And so I speak somewhat from that because I've been trying to rationalize my upbringing in the Ozarks with the strong Christian background that I had from that early childhood experience, along with what my parents exposed me to in my early childhood, and to rationalize that against what I've experienced here in the US and around the world in various, almost every part of the world. I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time in China or Russia, or India, but most of the other parts of the world I've been exposed to. So Marx Headroom is about exploring what is going on with me. I mean, I've had a lot of interesting conversations over the years with very powerful, rich, famous people, and I've never really conformed to one particular mode, except I've operated from or profession, so to speak. Although I've held executive positions in oil and gas and been trusted with a lot of money and with a lot of responsibility. I've helped raise 8 kids, had some long-term relationships in my life, and still find myself very productive in my own way. So I've got this FutureWise Energy channel that I opine from my experience in oil and gas, and just share my observations there with insights that I've gained from the technical work that I did, as well as from a lot of the powerful people that I was exposed to in my career and the insights that I can bring forward to whoever's watching. I'd like to say it's the collective that I'm sharing this with, but actually it looks like a pretty small segment of that collective that tunes in and kind of gets me. but I'll lay that aside. We'll come back to that later. The second channel that I have is called Transcendent. Transcendent is for people originally with, I was thinking I would address a lot of my um, journey into adulthood and in recovering from complex PTSD. I've had a number of shocks in my life. I've been struck by lightning and I've drowned and I'm still here. And I've also had a number of tremendous setbacks personally and professionally, and I don't know, whatever category you want to put them in. But there are things that a lot of people, when they hear me talk about my life, they're surprised at the zest and the energy and the vitality that I have, because many of the things that I've encountered and recovered from bring people, either they die or they end up killing themselves or finding their zest for life and for um, sharing their experience with the world is kind of muffled. And I'm kind of opposite. But if you bear with me here on Marx Headroom, the third channel that I've been putting stuff out on recently, this is where I just try to talk openly. And for some people, they may say I ramble and that I may repeat myself. And all I can say is that's the way that I am. Maybe some of it's results of head injuries from playing, college football or from all the trauma that I've been through, or from some of the misdiagnosed um, prescriptions that I took, and 20 years ago. So for whatever reason, I'm still here, and I've still got something to say. And I don't know that there's a great channel or particular singular um, label I could put on myself, but I find myself connecting with people, from people that are homeless to people that are extremely well off and have the or you might call a one percenter, because I've had such a diverse life. And from my heart, I mean the to try to find the best in everyone that I come across. So, and I attribute a lot of that to my early childhood exposure to biblical teachings and seeing the example of Jesus as this pure light that it kind of shocked me to see how others were viewing it. And he seemed to be kind of a divisive figure. And he continues to be, that way in some communities or in some groups or whatever. I find some people identify with it in a certain way that's fixed, and it ends up creating chaos rather than comfort. So, but for me, and it's taken a while to get here, because there were times when I would walk into a church, whatever denomination, or where I grew up was the Church of Christ, um, and I would have a lot of stress hit me. And I've done a lot of work on myself over the years using different modalities to reconcile all of that. But Transcendent was the YouTube channel where I have shared a lot of information about my journey of recovery from complex PTSD, early childhood sexual molestation by a neighbor boy, a few other things that I encountered in my childhood. But basically, one of my theories is that suppression really creates division. And it starts with division in yourself, denial of what you're feeling, and it ends up shutting you down and shutting off all of your perceptions of what's going on in the world. And after you reconcile that, that's why a lot of people just live in their head. And if everything's about rules that you can write and control and expect from yourself and from others, and you live this highly disciplined, life in a very controlled um, mode of operating, maybe like AI, will try to do, um, then that works. But the human spirit's always coming up with surprises, and it's always something that has defied all those rules. And one of the things that I observed when I was in the boardrooms of big, companies, and I was listening to a lot of the people that had been doing this for a long time. I started to say we. I think they let me into their team, but once they realized that my commitment was pretty thin, but that I was not necessarily a threat to them because I'm not overly materialistic. Um, but I just witnessed a lot of effort being made to find ways around this current rule set to get an advantage to dominate others in business and in society and in every circumstance. That theme just still continues today very strong. And I think one of the objectives that I have here on Marx Headroom is to discover a new platform that others might be able to use to operate on a more spiritual level that is, and I hesitate to use the word practical because practical as it's used in most situations today is almost like, like working a shovel. It's like if you got to dig a ditch, you need a shovel, and that's a practical, it's very, very surface. And where I'm working from is, I like to think from the depth of my heart, and trying to operate from values rather than from rules. And when you trust yourself and those values that are actually, I believe, not necessarily so much in our head or in our spiritual, whatever, however you compartmentalize your life, but actually when you learn that our humanity, there are common ways that we fail, and there's common ways that we are connected to our divinity. And I believe that I've operated to some degree, from that divinity my entire life, and had enough of a taste of it early on that, I find myself vacillating, coming, to it, and then thinking I've got it, and then it slips out of my hands. And then after some time passes, I find a way back. So that's what I hope to be able to share here on Mark's Headroom ultimately. And I think there's maybe an indirect path to discover that. And I know, like Transcendent, this channel that I have is very has been very good for me. It's really helped me lay down a lot of the philosophies and the experiences, and actually, it's been a connection to what I believe are probably some of my ancestors. I mean, the body that I'm working from here, as it says in the Bible, it's not my own. I mean, maybe I had a choice when I incarnated into the family and into this particular, organism that I'm speaking from right now. I could be very egotistical and say that I've made something of myself and I've formed this, but I I really don't necessarily believe that 100%. But I think from um, the standpoint of understanding of hierarchies, there is a hierarchy. There are some things that I know that I am responsible for in my day-to-day life. Like I got up this morning and I at a certain time that I was waking up, I was responsible for making that choice and setting that commitment and for that routine that I've committed myself to. Some people could say you're just in a pattern and you're just doing it over and over again like a squirrel in a cage. I tend to think that I've challenged that over the years. And yes, I may have some willpower and some discipline and some robotic behavior in my life, but I think those robotic things are part of the survival mechanism that we have. And if you can find a way to not compromise yourself totally in those patterns and leave enough latitude for surprises and for what is meant to maybe operate from your body rather than from the rule system that you're carrying around in your head, then you may have a more fulfilling, and actually you may have a chance to operate in a form that maybe God or whatever, whatever is behind our deeper purposes here in this lifetime, that may have a better chance of evolving in the circumstances that appear in your life. So a lot of people operate from a very contrived um, viewpoint. And it's funny, I've spent a lot of time in my life pursuing film acting, and acting was very well. It's kind of like athletics. It was a way of, when I would train for a game, whether basketball or football, there was a lot of discipline and willpower and experimentation, learning yourself, listening and getting feedback from others, and preparing to pursue athletics. And I did that very well. In fact, I was offered major college scholarships from, lots of fancy schools and fancy coaches. And ultimately, one of them offered me a car, and that was Jimmy Johnson when he was coaching at Oklahoma State with Dave Wanstead. And man, the words that came out of my mouth, I'm not going to repeat here, but just flatly rejected that without even thinking about it. It's almost like the words came out of my body, or it was channeled, from somewhere. And football never felt the same after that. I was not going to sell out. Nobody was going to own Mark. And I've had a number of people over the years repeat that back to me, is that nobody's going to ever control me. And I think a lot of that may come back to my loss of control when I was sexually molested by a neighbor boy when I was at 5 years old. When when that happens, you lose touch with your own, what they call today, agency. Um, I think, 10, 20 years ago, I didn't really look at it like that. It was like I just lost touch with what I wanted. And so I was just doing the best I could to continue some patterns that are continued to help me provide and survive by the values that I was raised with. But it is very saddening to recognize, and it's actually something that can sound kind of bold, but if it's said from a detached point of view, then there's no real fullness. There's no way to really connect with the loss. So, I'm not a martyr. I try not to be a tough guy, although I know that I could take a pretty good hit. But being kind and gentle along with strong has always been a real challenge. The boy that molested me was 10 years older than me, and his name was Mark. And for years, I didn't even understand why, when someone said Mark to me, that it hurt me. scared me. And it was just a signal of pain that I'd never really characterized or dealt with until much later in life. And ultimately, is if you ever go back and watch some of the Transcendent videos that I put out there, EMDR was very helpful for me in recovering more completely. And I won't say it's the only aspect of or tool that I've used in my recovery. I mean, there's been I can only credit it really to God in the way that I view things. But I think the way that I see God operating is not like most people. But I do feel like the path that He put me on let me have experiences that were very insightful to understand what's going on in the world and the communities, in the countries and states around me, and to look at the issues that we're experiencing in this life without getting identified or overly um, caught up in those. So I have some distance from those, and that's the perspective that I work from. And so there's a lot that a lot of ground that I've just covered. And if you're still with me, I've had some interesting feedback this week from these three channels that I put out there. Number one, on YouTube, I've started putting out some longer form videos on TikTok even. And I share some of this on of the Future Wise Energy on LinkedIn. And interestingly, the feedback I'm going to speak to now is from TikTok and from YouTube. And it's interesting because I don't find that my work gets widely circulated by the algorithms that, you can see the number of people that were exposed to your social media or to the media that you put out there. And then you can also see how many actually clicked and viewed. And a lot of the feedback that I've gotten, not just this past week, but also from prior experiences over the past, I've been doing this experimentation stuff with YouTube probably for about 12 years or so, because I've been film acting for a lot longer than that. And it mirrors a little bit of my experience with um, the acting world, is that there's something, sensational and watch-worthy with what I'm presenting and how I look on camera. But when you really, really get to the core of it, the feedback has been, wow, this is great. I wonder why there aren't more people that are watching this. And I think that may come back to not committing to a conformed singular role in life or in the media that I've put out there. And that can be hard to follow. It's not entertainment. It's not necessarily um, something that, where I'm telling people just because I do 5-day fast and only eat 2 days a week for the last 4 years, that you need to do it too. I'm not pushing anything. I'm not selling anything. And really, by the grace of God, I'm still here, healthy and strong, and have this attitude that I'm going to keep going. And I get discouraged from time to time. And sometimes the comments of just knowing clearly that I'm being misunderstood or I'm being labeled this way or that way, as I think I may have even spoken to last week on this Marx Headroom channel, that it shocked me that someone would see me a certain way, because the perspective that I really have is that I've been told over and over again, you have one of the most fascinating perspectives in lives to operate from. You should write a book. Or people are trying to tell me I need to put this out here. I need to share it somehow to reach other people. I find that I operate best when I'm working one-on-one with just another person and just listening and responding and, waiting for an invitation to go maybe a little bit deeper towards some things that I often pick up in people. Because then let me just skip over this real quick, because neuroscience, as I'm studying that more and more, a lot of the observations that they're making is that we're not seeing 100%, as most of us operate, kind of as the ancient mystics would say arrogantly, as if we knew everything, like Gurdjieff and Steiner. And I think a lot of people are, become like conspiracy theorists and are very angry that the 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 system is a certain way or things are not just. And if people could only wake up and see things like me, then everything would be okay. Well, I'm not in that camp. I'm more about acceptance and understanding that everyone has their certain aptitudes, skills, maybe gifts, and also their evolution is a stepwise process. And so I don't have great expectations for everyone, but you can see as I've gone around from different communities and spoken to different people, and you listen to their rules and the way that they're operating, and you can see how there's things that people know over here that are not even considered important over here. And there's viewpoints over here that totally mischaracterize people over here. So one of the things that I've just to make it kind of, I try to simplify things for myself sometimes because when I speak them, sometimes the words don't really sound as well or as descriptive or as accurate as my sense or my knowledge or wisdom or what I'm feeling. So I really struggle sometimes with our language, and I know that in certain cultures, they'll speak English language, but it's an entirely different vibe, different because language is really just communicating a fraction of what's going on with people. And that is what neuroscience is pointing out today, that basically we only really have a grasp on a small percentage, maybe 5% of what's really happening around us. And the rest is reality may just be pieced together from little tidbits of this and that we've carried forward and aggregated in our mind to help us survive and pay attention for danger signs or for whatever your focus is to satisfy whatever is really driving your life at this point in time. So if you do look at life as if most people that you encounter know, some people know that 5% really, really well. And some of them are very successful people or professionals or affluent or well respected for whatever role that they play in their own. You'll hear me use the word bubble. Um, I'm pausing because that was a washer that needs to be replaced. But the bubble creates its own set of hierarchies and values. And so, I noticed that some of my new or early subscribers to Marx Headroom are European. And it's funny because I worked with a psychiatrist a long time ago who told me he knew someone like me that really found a better home in Europe than he had in the US. And, you know, I'm really artistic, and so I'm not surprised that someone could go to France or Spain or Austria, Germany, wherever, and or maybe even Great Britain, and find a little more of a accepting culture for the eccentricities that I have, maybe the viewpoints that I have. But nonetheless, neuroscience is pretty interesting how it's exposing more and more of the way that we piece together reality and how little that we really know about the full spectrum of the whatever you want to call this. The old mystics used to call it the Maya, which was the matter and experience that we had between our consciousness and the conceptions that we had of all the forms of each other and our consciousness and the objects in our space. So that's out there a little bit, and I'm not trying to educate anybody about that, but I just have to speak to that because that becomes something that is so well. It's a strong perspective to for me to consider that we're only really picking up on maybe 5% of the full capacity or the full spectrum of experience around us. And when you meet somebody, they may have a perspective that's showing them a little bit of something that you didn't see. And if you're not comfortable with yourself, or you've been taught to have a bias against someone that has that other perspective, then you're going to see that as a flaw in them. And you may even feel like, there's danger from that person. And I think that's where a lot of the misunderstandings begin in the world. And I know early on, I had to deal with the rage that I felt from the experiences that I had, where all the control over something very, I guess, sacred, um, was taken from me, at least temporarily. Um, and to reconcile our emotions and our wants, our desires, our feelings, and our thoughts against the rules and the way that I was told the way things should be, and then seeing other people, in some cases, act in ways that were totally in defiance to some of the values that they would talk about. And so anyway, I've done a lot of work on myself, and I've watched a lot of other people. I used to read a lot of books, Jungian psychology. My father was had master's degrees in psychology that he earned when I was in early childhood. And I think I picked up a lot of that. That was a gift. So back to violence. I think that's an important thing to consider today. I watched a football player who's really, I think he's paid millions of dollars a year and is considered to be a really good defensive player for the Philadelphia Eagles. I don't even know his name, but I watched him spit on the quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys last night. That really disgusted me. And it reminded me of one of those, my decision of just getting away from football without any disrespect for it, because I think it served a purpose for me during my childhood and adolescence to understand my rage and deal with violence myself, my own violence, take responsibility for that. But I was not identified with it. And I think I had a lot of pressure to identify with it. And for some reason I was able to let that go. But violence is something that, I think, our obsession with American football is a little mind splitting, considering how brutal that is, and the real attitude that most of those men have out there on the field, in particular, of destroying each other. Even if it's just a temporary mindset, coming off the field and operating civilly is a real challenge for the human being. And I think these sports, they serve a purpose for the communities and around the world, probably at least in this stage of our evolution, of not dealing with the failures that we have as human beings of nurturing each other and owning the other 95% of the stuff that we pretend, most of us pretend, are not there. And the violence is something that just continues to draw our attention. And whether it's a school shooting or a mass shooting somewhere, we continue to find that violence is a we certainly have not evolved to the point where we understand it and have it under control by the rules that we make. So there may be another approach that, ultimately nature may take care of it for us. The American Indian in me, the Gurdjieff, I'm a person that's really studied a lot of the Gnostic texts from, whether they were biblical scriptures or some of the other ancients that have left their mark on us. And we carry this work on to communicate and bring hope to the world, that in spite of all of the failures that we, can look around and see, that we still carry on and we're still here and we're, bringing more children into the world. And we need to find a way to help them continue with that spirit. A lot of people feel threatened by the violence and artificial intelligence. And I find one of the interesting perspectives around, well, I have the chance right now to share things that other, if you want to call me a mystic, mystics were hiding in caves just 100 years ago, and probably in some parts of the world are still doing that, and afraid to reveal what's really going on. But I find the transparency and some of the vehicles that we have available to us, like this vehicle through technology, is hopeful that we'll find ways to, not that I'm going to do it, but maybe I'll provoke something in someone and they'll see it. And it might just be that one person that has a breakthrough that really opens up the eyes of a lot of people to help evoke some changes that we just have failed to allow. Because I believe that our better well, the parts of our values that are really aligned with preserving our our lives, our families, our communities, and if you're really aligned with those, maybe that's too altruistic, and maybe everyone is really, or not everyone, but maybe a lot of people are just here to get what they can out of the 50 to 100 years they might get here on Earth and get as much money and as many good times and as much sex and dominance as possible. You know, if that's your view, you're probably not watching, because I think those may be things that the algorithm, or, you know, they tell you the audience is looking for. But, you know, there is so much that I do see in people and encounter, that I see more and more people becoming more alert and more aware. Now, they still may be acting out, and, you know, some of these people may be in their 20s, and it may take another 20 or 30 years for some of those people to really own their power and the potential that they have to help their fellow man, and to perpetuate some of the higher values that a lot of us, you know about, talk about, feel frustrated about, because we really have not been able to be those or live those in our community. We still don't have a way to I mean, we think of capitalism as the best form of interacting, and we ascribe some values from these old religious texts to those, sometimes to maybe build some trust into our communities or with each other. But, you know, by and large, we still wrestle with our shadows in the collective dominance and violence. I know I was in Bangkok, Thailand, the first time I was there, and I heard about these fighting camps where young men would go and train with these ancient martial arts, and then they would go on, I think it was on the weekends, where the fights that I attended, where these camps would come together and they would have these organized fights. And you could tell that the crowd was really into the sport, but they weren't identified with one camp or another. At least the crowd seemed to show some great reverence for the fact that these young men were fighting using the traditions from, you know, brought forth from each camp, which had its own kind of art form, and they would fight. And when someone was on the attack and literally winning or beating the other person, there'd be this rise in the emotional vibe in the arena. And then once it was all over, it was peace. There was, as I looked around, there was this, of course, this has been 30 years ago or 20, 25 years ago. It may not be the same today, but in this experience I had, I looked around and there was this kind of solitude, this recognition across the room for, you know, this is a violent way for us to be entertained, and out of respect for both parties, because they were both necessary, you know, for this to be entertaining, you had to have, you know, a two participants that were willing to throw it all out there, and one, you know, almost live and another almost die. But that reverence was just silence afterwards. There was not a victory lap. There was none of the arrogance about, someone saying, well, God loved me, I did it all right, and that's why I won, or we won. There was more of a very, what I consider to be a dignified and solemn acceptance of the humanity that had been exposed through that stage that they put violence on. So, trying to think if there's more that I wanted to say today. I've really been trying to get away from a contrived or an overly controlled or thought out from the head way of putting stuff out here in Marx Headroom, because I think the audience I'm really looking for is out there. As my old washer tumbles once again. So the audience is out there, and I know some of the things that I say are very insightful, valuable, and powerful. But some of it does fly in the face of common knowledge, or common, maybe not knowledge, maybe knowledge is not the best word, common, the safe thought that's out there. And, I'll just tell you one thing that comes to mind right now is that let's say like future-wise energy, like I'm going to go talk to someone about the current geopolitics influence on oil and gas prices and how much supply that we have here in the U.S. and some of the angles that I see Trump and his administration taking that are rather new in the scope of the maybe 50 years that I've been, kind of privy to how things operate in global power, geopolitics, and energy. And so there's a lot of people that believe, and I used to believe this myself, I got into corporate planning when I was like 24, 25 years old at Mobil Oil. And I was really good at running computers. I was great at pattern recognition and had this engineering mindset and curiosity and brought a lot of energy and vitality. I was running 5 personal computers. I was working on a Cray whenever I was, 23 years old. So a lot of people, think the more charts that you have, the more graphs, the more technical analysis, then the better answer you're going to have, the better understanding you're going to have. Well, there may be some truth to that at some level. Certainly there's an understanding that you do gain by examining the data that you have. But at some point, I remember looking at the data and questioning whether the data was even valid. And you start to recognize that maybe you're only capturing the data that you need to see because that's where the transactions occur in oil and gas. So we're really only measuring the sales of oil and gas, not necessarily the production of it, because there's some losses that you have. There's a lot of reasons that there's shrinkage and there's some physical changes that take place over what comes out of the earth versus what's ultimately sold, tracked, and measured. And then sometimes what's reported may not even be 100% of what's sold because, well, let's face it, there is some reasons why someone might not report some of the revenue that they're putting in their pocket to avoid taxes or to hide whatever. So once you start to recognize how big some of those losses are, and when you're looking at these charts and trying to come to conclusions, you recognize how flawed everything is, from the measurement to the analysis, and to get overly identified with the charts that you're putting out there and some of the conclusions you start to become a little skeptical of. And ultimately, I can remember having a conversation with one of my mentors in particular, who I was very close to, was a father figure to me. That's when I was exposed to the idea of many of the ideas of Schumacher, which, if you've listened to me on FutureWise, I talk about Schumacher's work. He wrote a book that was published, I think, in 1973. I think it was called Small is Beautiful: Economics as If People Mattered. And there's a lot of some concepts there that I think were very comforting to me at that time. And ultimately, when I had these charts that I was making that had, 20 lines on them, and they were, just bizarre how much data that I was moving around to put into these presentations. And this mentor of mine was going around the world, and because he used to run Saudi Aramco and I think he was number 2 at Exxon at one point in time. He had a lot of attention put to him, and so he would talk, and people would tune into these charts that we'd make, or I would make, and like, oh, he's so smart and everything. And actually, behind the scenes, what he finally shared with me was these things don't really tell the story. What tells the story is those powerful minds that are, making decisions around the world about our commitment to oil and gas in the U.S. or not, for whatever reason. And as we're learning more and more today, we can look back and see, they were more than happy to run the price of oil down to just meager levels in the 80s to combat the Soviet Union. And they basically, bankrupted the Soviet Union with oil. And you can see the same discussions and tensions are at work today in the world with the tariffs on oil, the embargoes, and with the penalties that are posed for buying oil from Russia, and those considerations. There's no predictability in that stuff. It's more about trying to predict human nature than it is about watching, what's coming out of the earth. And then when you see all of the influence of human behavior on the measures that we make in life, you can see where this thing that I think I first heard Bill Clinton talk about, confirmation bias. Basically, Clinton, during an interview after he leaves office, is basically telling, I think it was during a CNN interview, that everyone basically just tunes in to hear what they want to hear. And they're really just trying to feel safe with all the data that they collect. And that kind of goes back to the neuroscience that I spoke to earlier of, we really tune into about 5% of the entire spectrum that's available to us as human beings. And that's where we feel safe. And that's where we're really looking for evidence that we're right about what we're doing today. And if you even look further into the neuroscience, the timing of your observations and the occurrence of the events are often skewed. We may feel like, yeah, I wanted that. But it actually just showed up, and we went back and told ourselves that's what I wanted. So that's out there, and I can't explain that, and I'm not going to try here on Marx Headroom today. But I have covered a lot of ground here, and hopefully it's been something that's been provocative to you, maybe entertaining, maybe even like what my old acting coach said, Mark, you'd be great at stand-up comedy. And so you may be laughing at something I've said, or maybe just at me, and that's okay. But I'm going to be back next week. I've really committed to continuing to use this format, at least on this particular channel, to try to touch others that may be aligned with this. And maybe one day some of you will share this with enough other people that will create our own category for something like this. And actually, whenever someone, writes me a note and says, Mark, this is really great content. I don't know why aren't more people commenting, or why aren't more people sharing this, or more people seeing what, getting excited about, something that you're sharing here. And it's probably up to us to do that, because I think the algorithms are really, honed in on they can only repeat what the majority of people are doing. And there are some of us that are here that are really truly original. And I guess that's one of the reasons I'm not so scared of artificial intelligence, because I'm like, let's turn over the stuff, the patterns that we just are doing robotically, and make room for more of us to find our uniqueness and those things where the values that we talk about that we haven't learned how to focus on during our lives and carry out in our being in the world, directly with each other. Maybe that's where we can put some attention rather than into these robotical things that we've kind of built up big egos and a system that it's working maybe better than it was 30 years ago or 200 years ago, but I do believe we can do better. Well, this is Marx Headroom signing off, wishing you all the best.
We just came into New Mexico, and ever since we left Elk City, Oklahoma, it's been nothing. And you're right. I mean, it is absolutely zero. So just wanted to touch base. I just stopped the camp. So you take care. Love you. Bye.